resettling of immigrants and refugees to Canada outside of the Jewish community, but also within the Jewish community. He decided to create this lecture series every year to honor and further the study of social work and human rights in a city that was home to him and to our family, and that was dear to him, and a place that educated my grandfather and where he raised his family. Canada was a country for him that embraced my grandfather and held him as a young immigrant, and where he was able to thrive to the point of being able to be self-sufficient and give back. His involvement in the McGill School of Social Work and that of my late grandmother was a huge source of pride for him. I should say that my late grandmother in her own right, became a social worker and trained as one of the first women who graduated from McGill School of Social Work. And the two of them worked as a team together throughout their entire careers. My grandmother, up until she passed away a number of years ago, was still on foot delivering Meals on Wheels and other forms of support to people in the community, never once deviating from her truest, deepest pride. If you asked her who she was at 2 in the morning and you woke her up, she'd say, "I'm a social worker." This was so critically important to her as part of her identity. But really, this lecture series is meant to further these values, meant to raise awareness, meant to keep the conversation going. And it's really meant to thank all of you, those of you who are doing this work, to elevate and to publicize the absolute critical necessity of social work, and to acknowledge those who've given their lives to this commitment. So we thank you for your service and your diligent hard work. As you engage in this work, you are truly aiding in the effort to repair, I believe, a fragmented world. And we, the citizens of this great earth, truly thank you.
Thank you so much for those words, Lila and Wanda. I'm now very happy to present Sandy. Sandy Ho is a research associate at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy, where she provides management and research support to the Community Living Policy Center. Sandy is also the founder of the Disability and Intersectionality Summit, a conference that centers marginalized disabled people in a setting organized by disabled activists from across the USA. Prior to joining the Lurie Institute team, Sandy served as the program coordinator of the Thrive Mentoring Program at EasterSeals Massachusetts, a program that worked with young women with disabilities who are mentored by older women with disabilities across the state. She is the founder of the Letters to Thrive project, and in 2015, she was honored as a White House Champion of Change for her work with young women with disabilities. As a disability community organizer and activist, Sandy brings an intersectional lens to centering the experiences and communities most impacted by injustice to her areas of work. She is also a part-time public policy student at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. Sandy identifies as a disabled and queer Asian American woman. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Amanda, Melanie, and Wanda. And Lila, thank you for providing that backstory to how this series came about. I really appreciate that grounding to begin this lecture. So I first wanted to just say that with any conversation, and particularly as a community organizer, it's always important to me that I try my best to meet the audience where they are. With that in mind, that is how I structured the session today. So we will begin with some slides around disability justice and what is this framework. Then I will be moving into some moments where disability justice is present in my own life and work. And I will end this session with a letter that I write to all of you who are future social workers. And I will do my best to provide time for questions and answers. Will admit that I'm not great about pacing myself, but I will leave that for Amanda to help keep me in check a bit. The other thing I want to say, before I begin, is that I come to you all with the privilege of, having been a disabled person my entire life and the privilege of being a part of this movement and this community and studying this work and being a disability community organizer. However, I do not have the privilege of having a social work background. So I just want to be very transparent about that, is that I am not a social worker. I have worked with a few social workers as a child, but that is just not my background. So the final thing I want to say, because it cannot be ignored with this broader context that we are in, and take it however you want to, and but I just want to also say that on behalf of the U.S., I do apologize for all of the anxiety that America has caused our Canadian neighbors. We have not been good neighbors. So that being said, I'm going to share my screen with the slides. Okay, so we begin disability justice and social work practice. The roadmap today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to cover what is disability justice. Some of you may have been familiar with the first chapter in the introduction in the Disability Justice Primer, Skin, Tooth, and Bone. But if you are not, I will be providing just some very basic and foundational content to that. And then, having provided that foundation of what the Disability Justice Framework is, I will move into what do those principles look like concretely in somebody's life and in my work. And then I will end with a letter to future social workers and Q&A. So what is disability justice? The origin story is that it begins with, so it was founded in 2005, but let's take a step back from that. So the Disability Justice Framework was founded in response to the U.S. disability rights movement. And the disability rights movement in the U.S. Started in the 60s and continued on, it still continues on today. But the birthplace of it really in the 60s and 70s. And it begins with this movement towards deinstitutionalization, right? Getting disabled people out of institutional state hospitals. And it was a push that started, that was contributed by both the families and parents of people with disabilities and also disabled people themselves. So that's sort of where it begins. But as you might imagine, for folks who have the means to get out of institutional settings and the oppression of state condoned incarceration, essentially, are people who have privileges in our society, be they predominantly white, predominantly physically disabled, and many of whom had connections among their family members to get folks out of these settings. And, a lot of the disability rights movement that became sort of like a swelling point of the disability rights work was when civil rights were finally provided to people with disabilities. And so civil rights, bypassing laws such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, it finally recognizes that disabled people are not just people in our communities, but have and should have the access to be treated and deemed equal in the eyes of the government and our laws. So that included equal access to housing, to education, employment, to public transportation. However, we also know from past civil rights and social justice movement that laws do not beget justice. Just because we have equal access to laws does not mean that everybody is able to access laws and the litigation and the legal process that is necessary in order for somebody to get to that point to begin with, right? And so in 2005, in response to the fact that many disabled people are not just experiencing their lived experiences through their identity as a person with a disability, but are also people of color, women, young children, immigrants, refugees, people who are LGBTQ. And so in what ways do their intersectional identities inform their lived experiences of disability? And they're not just their lived experiences, but how they navigate through our systems of government and public services had a lot to do with the experiences of a person with a disability. And so the disability justice framework is a response to the lack of acknowledgement around how ableism informs and impacts disabled people in multiple ways. And so I will get into that later on in my presentation. But that is the crux of the disability justice framework. It is about who has the power in terms of defining who the person with a disability is, the language that that person uses and has access to, how that person is reflected by society, and also by the system of ableism that really cuts across all systemic oppression. So the founders, it's important to name the founders are Patricia Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. I think that in today's times, the term disability justice has, in some spheres, has kind of been flung around a lot, and the use of the framework and the terminology doesn't always align with how the originators of this framework believed. And so these are all disabled people of color, LGBTQ, trans, and non-binary. And it began primarily with disabled people of color who are also women and femmes. So what constitutes disability justice, and what is this framework? So disability justice framework consists of 10 principles. The first is intersectionality. So that is the idea that somebody's disability identity is not just informed by the medical model notions of disability. It's not just the diagnostic criteria of disability, but rather it's also formed by their gender, their age, their country of origin, their immigration status. And all of these have different implications of a person's disability experiences depending on the setting and the environment that they're in. The second principle is leadership of those most impacted. The goal, the end sort of reach of the disability justice framework is really toward collective liberation. And so with that in mind, the founders of the disability justice framework believe very deeply that in order for collective liberation to truly be achieved, it must come from leadership of those most impacted. They must be driving not just the conversation and the solutions and the strategies, but and I know that there's often the phrase of, who is being invited to the table, but who built the table? Leadership of those most impacted have to be present. The third is anti-capitalist politics. So in our capitalist-driven global society, we put a lot of emphasis on the value of a person based on their productivity, right? When you meet somebody, one of the first things that come to mind is often, what do you do? And this framework believes that all people, all disabled people, have inherent value and worth and humanity that should be respected outside of their quote-unquote capitalist productivity. Right? That it is not to say somebody who is a disabled person and houseless has any less worth or recognition or respect in society than somebody who is like myself, a student. The fourth principle is cross-movement solidarity. This put quite simply, is to say to movements in social justice and other civil rights movements, is to recognize that your people are also our people, and our people are also your people. In other words, disabled people are not just the people who are in the quote unquote disability rights or disability justice community. We are everywhere. Right? So we are in the US, we are trying to, some disabled migrants are trying to apply for asylum to come to the US. Some folks are incarcerated. Some folks are experiencing conversion therapy through LGBTQ policies that are deeply outdated. But to all of those movements and to all of those areas of social justice, we recognize that disabled people are also being impacted by their social justice efforts. Likewise, the disability rights and disability justice movement are also in cross-movement work with other social justice movements as well. Recognizing wholeness. So this principle essentially is about the ways in which we perceive somebody. It's not just to look at somebody as a person with a disability, but also what are the other experiences that have deepened their understanding of their own identity and the way that they navigate our systems. So for somebody to say to me, for instance, that I am a short-statured wheelchair user, right, erases the fact that I'm Asian American, erases the fact that I identify as a queer woman, erases the fact that I am a child of immigrants and refugees. And so recognizing wholeness is about seeing the whole individual within the context of their identities. Sustainability is about the fact that disability justice is a movement that is not in a rush to make sure that certain laws get to Congress. It is not in a rush to, recognize that budget needs to be passed before January 20th for the US. But to say that sustainability means our movement needs to be paced by our bodies, by our environments that we're in, and that we need to build in for ourselves our own sustainability. I think that this is particularly a really important point because we have seen the ways that marginalized communities cannot depend on state policies and state interventions for their own liberation. We've seen the ways that through mutual aid during this time of the pandemic, communities have had to fend and care for each other. And so that is how sustainability is embodied. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity. So the disability rights movement, as I mentioned earlier, was predominantly led by physically disabled white people. And cross-disability solidarity is not just to say that we need to include, go down the checkbox list of, is there a blind person? Is there a deaf person? Is there somebody with intellectual disability? But more meaningfully implement solidarity in the sense of how can we ensure that every single member of our disability community has access to their basic needs, to contribute and participate in our collective efforts towards collective liberation. Interdependence. I think this is one of the most powerful principles of the disability justice framework because it speaks directly to the idea of independence that is so ingrained in US politics, right? It is there in our US Constitution. It has become the cornerstone of how people in America have been fed and spread this philosophy, this belief that if we pick ourselves up by our bootstraps by ourselves and we work really hard, we're going to make it. Rather than emphasizing this idea of disability rights and independence, disability justice says what we need in order for collective liberation to happen is interdependent. It's to say, how can my community also check and balance and provide our access needs, our safety, and it's really a reliance on community. So collective access is, again, similar to commitment to cross-disability solidarity, but it's to say that no one person's access should be overlooked or thought of as a priority over somebody else's. And finally, collective liberation, which is, as I mentioned, the premise of the disability justice framework, that by embodying all of these principles, we can achieve collective liberation, and that nobody's liberation is separate from our own. So this is a campaign that my friends Alice Wong and Mia Mingus put together, called the Access is Love campaign. So if you want to check it out for either both more reading materials about how we can further the disability justice framework in our own lives, and also more reading material about just how to create disability justice friendly spaces and conversations, I encourage you that you can scan this QR code with your cell phone, and it will take you directly to the website. Want to give people a chance to do that. And so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit to a conversation around how disability justice has been present in my own life. And I'm going to start with this timeline. So for some of you who may have had the opportunity to read my piece in Wikimedia, I write a little bit about some of these stories, so if it's a repeat, I apologize. So my identity of disability started way before I even existed, way before my family existed. It starts with my mom in 1960s, Northern Vietnam, in Hanoi, where she was born. And during this time, not only was there the Vietnam War happening, but also in her neighborhood, my mom was a child under the age of about 10 or 12, I believe, and she would see this disabled person in her neighborhood dragging himself from house to house, essentially panhandling, asking for food, asking for money. And she'd tell me that she was terrified of this person, that nobody really explained to her why he looks the way he does, who is he, what is his story, why does he go from house to house asking for food and money. And whenever she would see him, though, she would immediately cross the street or run back inside to her house to hide. And so I share that moment because this is where intersectionality plays in, right? This idea that the notion and understanding of disability doesn't come necessarily from a doctor providing you with a diagnosis or a prescription. It comes from our cultural values, our ideas, our experiences, our neighborhood, our environments that we are in, and the ways that we form our understandings of disability and the people who are around us. So, fast forward, my parents meet in the US, in Boston, Massachusetts. My mom was a refugee from Vietnam to China and then emigrated to the US. My father is from Hong Kong. And they make a life and a family in the US in the early 80s. I have an older brother who's here in this photo. And then I come along. My older brother is not disabled, and I am my parents' only disabled child, and I'm also their only daughter. So the 1990s happened, and in the US, that is one of the landmark moments for the disability rights movement, is when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And that was just sort of like the sweeping policy that provided equality and access for people with disabilities. And that September, I start kindergarten. And in this photo here is my first school photo. And you notice that there's this weird gray blanket behind me. I'm dressed as my parents sent me to school that day. I believe this was an outfit from China that we had gotten in during our summer vacation previously. But why is there a blanket covering my wheelchair? And so despite the fact that the Americans with Disabilities Act has passed, and that my parents had the privilege to send me to a great public school system in the States, still, it is clear that my identity as a disabled student, as a student who is attending quote-unquote mainstream public schools, the way I see myself and the way others see me were vastly different. And the notion that, you know, I did not have the autonomy to decide how I was depicted, and that nobody asked me whether or not this blanket should go on the back of my wheelchair, just never crossed anybody's minds. It was saying, you know what, we're going to give you equal access to the classroom, to the learning. You're going to be a part of the school community. You're going to have friends. But this wheelchair part of you is a little bit too much. So I wanted to share this photo, which is taken in Canaan Square. And it was the summer vacation that our family took prior to me going to kindergarten. We notice here that I'm wearing my Boston Red Sox hat. Shout out to the Montreal Expos and other baseball fans. But what is important here is that this is how I see myself. This is how my family sees me. Is that we are a family that has Chinese and Vietnamese backgrounds and cultural and history, politics, that contributes to, you know, not only why my parents decided to create a family in the U.S., because in 1989 there was the Canaan Massacre. Right? It was the student rebellion that called for democracy and transparency and governance. And they told us about this. I was about to start kindergarten. My older brother, I think, was in the 4th grade. And this is a part of the disability story, because I cannot separate my identity as a disabled woman from the cultural aspects and the history and the politics that also contribute to my notions and understanding of where my family comes from and how those ideas and the origin story of that plays into how I navigate systems of oppression. So one final story I'm going to share about the 1990s is this was also a period where I was undergoing a lot of just doctor's appointments, where like every few weeks I would have to go to Boston Children's Hospital for X, Y, and Z reasons. And one day, it was a routine checkup. My mom took me to the ophthalmologist, or as I referred to it then, the eyeologist. And the eye doctor is doing his thing, right? He's like looking into my pupils, doing the whole chart thing. Then all of a sudden he goes, "That's so cool. I've never seen somebody with your disability type before. This is fascinating. Is it okay with you if I ask some of my friends to come into the examination room so that they can see this?" So let's do a reality check here. My parents are not familiar with the language, not familiar with the extremely convoluted system of medical care in the US. You know, I am their first disabled child. So they had no idea how to respond. But the moment here of power is that they believed, because they were the medical professionals, that they automatically knew better. And so this happened quite a bit throughout my childhood. And it is also because I was a patient at teaching hospitals. So there was sort of this assumption that patients were people to be, contribute to the medical education of the medical student. So before I know it, the entire room is filled with medical students, and just they stood in a line in front of me, and each one took a turn looking into my eyes. And those experiences repeatedly ingrained into me that, this idea of recognizing wholeness, the principle of intersectionality, were things that I could not identify and could not speak for myself yet, but I knew that there were things that were lacking for me as a child. But now I want to flash forward to the 2000s. So 2005, as I talked about very briefly in the beginning of this presentation, the disability justice framework has been established. And it was unbeknownst to me, in 2005, I was graduating high school. But this poster says all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with no body left behind. This is disability justice. This is an image of one of the founders, Leroy Moore. So unbeknownst to me, all of this is happening in the disability justice world. In 2007, though, I was a wide-eyed sophomore in college, my second year of university. I was a global studies major, and I had made the decision to attend a semester in Washington, D.C. because I thought, as a global studies and international relations major, this is where I needed to be. And up until that point, I had never really left home on my own before. And against my parents' well-intentioned wishes and concerns, I decided to leave, to go anyway. So I saved up all of my work study money from the semester previously. It was a part of my financial aid package to have a job on campus. So I saved up all of the earnings from that and bought a one-way ticket on a Greyhound bus from Boston to Washington, D.C. And it was a 12-hour bus journey. And I remember reflecting viscerally, just feeling viscerally like how free and excited, but also really nervous and uncertain I felt. Uncertain and nervous because I thought, well, maybe my family's right. Maybe Washington, D.C. is not for people who look and move in the world like I do, because I didn't know anybody who was a person with a disability in the D.C. area. The weeks leading up to the day I left, I had spent months, piecing together my own accommodations and access. So I made sure I got in contact with a doctor, made sure that I found a company to repair my wheelchair if that were ever to happen, mapped out all of the elevator stations on the public transit, and all of this, the skills that I had acquired to do these things were because of my experiences in the 90s. I had watched my parents navigate the system to connect the services and to do these things for me. And so by the time I left in 2007, it was like, okay, well, you've been teaching me to self-advocate for my own wishes and goals, and this is my goal. Suddenly, though, because I was no longer a inspiring, cute child, my needs and goals as an adult with a disability were no longer something to look fondly upon, but more seen as a risk. And I think we see that playing out today during the pandemic, which I will talk about later on. So fast forward, 4 months go by, the semester ends, and I fly back to Boston, having learned just as much about international relations as I did about disability rights, including how in 1978, disabled activists in Denver, Colorado, had chained themselves to Greyhound buses in order to get on the bus. They laid out in front of the bus and refused to move and said, we're not moving until you pass the laws that give us the right to access public transit, to move. And so when I learned that, though, that was the moment when I committed to myself that I want to be a part of this community, this movement that the decisions the disabled activists and leaders in the past did directly enable me to show up as fully as I can in this present and in the future. So in 2013, this is a photo from the Thrive program of the young women with disabilities. And I asked them to write letters to their younger selves. A lot of these young women were between the ages of 14 and 26. Some of them, were ready to hit the ground running. They were asking me burning questions like, well, how am I supposed to date if I always have a personal care attendant around? Or how come during prom season, the mannequins at the mall are never posed in dresses sitting down or with a cane or in a wheelchair? And to me, their questions were not only, a part of their developmental process of how they see themselves, but it also resonated in me because it was clear to me that they were questions coming from a place of isolation. Isolation in the sense that they did not see themselves reflected in their own future. What were their choices? And so that was why I had their mentors, who were also older disabled women, to write letters to their younger selves so that the mentees could see the possibilities for themselves. And so this body of work had two purposes. The first was because I knew that it would require lived experiences of older disabled women to write to these experiences and to respond to these questions with power and a lot of intimacy that they knew and could convey. And the second was because just as there were many young women with disabilities who were ready to talk about, what does it mean to be a disabled woman, there were many who were not ready yet. But the letter will still remain for them when they are ready. It was about collecting narratives and letters and words that come from those who would be most impacted by the intersections of gender and disability, and provide a point of welcome into the community and into the movement. So when I posted these letters on Tumblr back in the day, what I did not expect was letters from women with disabilities came in from across the US and then around the world. And it was clear to me that, this is not only something that was needed by the global community of women with disabilities, but also because nobody had ever asked them, or maybe they had, but they hadn't captured it in this way. And it hadn't been left for future generations to continue to sustain that movement. So I'm going to pause here for a second, just do a quick check-in, and ask how people are doing, if there are questions so far.
In previous talks, we would take questions starting from around 2 until we end at 2:25.
Okay. So in 2016, so that was the final moment on the timeline. A group of friends and I, group of disabled people of color friends and I, were sitting around talking about the public and drastic increase of police violence on Black and brown bodies that were happening in the US. So this was around the time of Ferguson, and there were moments and questions that we had that, we knew that this was not a new problem in the disability community, that police violence on marginalized disabled bodies had been happening for years and generations. But what we didn't know was what can we do? And we also at that time saw a lot of TED Talks that were being shared across social media. And a lot of these TED Talks, had people with disabilities who were predominantly white, well-educated, middle to upper social class income brackets. We're also talking about ways that they accommodated their disability or overcame their disability, ways that they access these cool, high-tech gadgets that made their lives better. But none of these narratives that were being shared through the TED Talk really connected with my friends and I. And we knew that this was not the narrative disability that is experienced by the community that we're from. And so we thought about, well, what would it take to put together a conference that would not only have all disabled people of color speaking as presenters, but what would it take to organize a space and a conference that would implement disability justice principles at its core mission and way that we organize, not just the space itself, but as our internal organizing team. And we sent out what I now know is called a needs assessment. But we sent out a survey because, we thought we had this great idea, but we also wanted to double check to make sure that this was not something that was already being done in the community and that wasn't already something that exists. So we asked on that survey, I think it was 3 questions, but is this something that you'll be interested in presenting at or organizing with us? 2, we asked, is this something that already exists? Is there a conference or some sort of event that is organized by a team of disabled activists that would elevate and uplift disabled people of color? People in the community and across the country were extremely excited for us. And so we were like, okay, well, let's do this thing. And in response to the community, we put together a conference that first year with pretty much like shoestring budget. We rented out a nonprofit conference room. And that Saturday morning, all of a sudden, like 150 disabled people show up. And this nonprofit building had like 1 elevator that was about the size of a closet. So the building manager comes down to us and is like, I don't know what you all are doing here, but you're pushing the room limit and we're concerned about safety hazards. And my friends and I looked at each other like, safety, like fire hazard. After all the things that disabled people have had to push through and have to protest for, we were like, okay, whatever with your fire hazard. So we carried on. And some of the ways that I will give examples of in terms of the ways that access is implemented in this. So first off, what I did not know at that time in 2016 was that typically at conferences, people have to submit their proposals and then they get accepted and then they have to pay these ridiculous large sums of money to present at a conference. That's like the pre-registration fee and all of these other whistles and bells to it. And I was like, no, we're not doing any of that because knowing the community that we are from, disabled people of color who are living on restricted incomes, who have not had the platform or the opportunity or even have been asked to speak, we needed to ensure that if we are going to intentionally bring our community to the space, that we needed to build in a process that would enable them to show up as fully as they can. So instead of having them pay us, we paid everybody else. We provided everybody a flat stipend honorarium. We ensured that all of the conference materials and presenters would be recorded and live streamed. So if you go to that website I shared earlier, you'll find a list of all of the presentations on YouTube. We were committed to providing free access to our content because for so many disabled people who are either in institutional settings or are chronically ill or cannot leave their beds. Like, this is how they were going to access the content. And the response to our proposals that we put out was, you know, we didn't want to have a theme, so to speak. We didn't ask people to talk about X, Y, and Z. Rather, we said, what are your joys? What is your life's work? And what is your expertise? Like, you tell us what you want to talk about, and we'll create a conference agenda out of that. And so that's how the Disability and Intersectionality Summit started. And the previous conference was last held in 2018, where we had the youngest presenter was 12, I think, and the oldest was, I think, in their mid-60s. We had somebody present from a robot because she was unable to fly in from Nebraska. We had artists, we had authors do book reads. And this is a space that, because it is centered on access, that is beyond elevators and ramps and captions and, you know, whether or not bathroom doors are wide enough, but access in the sense of how can we ensure disabled people of color who are too used to having to disclose their disability, too used to being scrutinized and policed, to come to a space where they can just be in community. And so that is what the kind of heart of the Intersectionality Summit has always been about. But that is not to say that we are not without our own critiques. I mean, we were called out by our own community for the fact that, you know, the people who are most privileged to do organizing work are people who, like me, have a consistent paycheck, you know, the means to do unpaid labor, which is predominantly much of organizing work. And our first organizing team were also, I mean, it was a mix, but many were white disabled people. And so, you know, our community calling in our work in our first attempt was something that we did not shy away from. We asked for it. You know, we knew that to build something that would be intentional, that could be better than it was, meant that we needed to ask for feedback and for criticism. So what we've done is, in response to that, is to now we ask the previous year's presenters to join the organizing team. So that way there is a cycle, a sustainability to the work, so that although I am the founder, I have no interest in being the face of the Intersectionality Summit. It does not need to have the Sandy Ho thumbprint to it. That is not movement work. Movement work is that we are ensuring people in the community who are experiencing oppression can speak truth to power, can celebrate and be part of their own work in a way that is not in response to the headlines or in response to making sure we have all of our diversity check boxes. So that kind of concludes the overview of the ways disability justice has been present throughout my work. And so I'm now going to end by reading the letter that I wrote to future social workers. So, dear future social worker, first off, I want to provide a content warning that this letter will have content about filicide and mass murder. That being said, I know that you want to help. And for many of you, I believe that the compulsion to roll up your sleeves and get out into the community to move equity and social justice forward in the lives and families of your clients is innate. And at this point of your social work career, I can imagine that the sense of help that you began with has been shaped by the experiences you've had in your community placements this year and by learning about anti-oppression practices. Also, though, in the environment of our current global community, I imagine that your sense of help has likely been pushed to the edge. Perhaps it has also evolved into something full of questions. Each of those questions no less filled with the same sense of urgency and a desire to do something that led you into this field. So whatever your sense of help looks like now in comparison to the day you began this journey, whether it looks vastly and completely different or has shifted slightly, I'm here to tell you that that is what community work looks like. So everything you are doing, learning, and thinking about at this point in your social work education, and everything that you will be doing throughout your career will be felt in some way by disabled people. Contrary to the more traditional and still predominant framing of the disability population, people with disabilities do not exist only in hospital settings. We do not only exist in social welfare offices, or in classrooms for children with disabilities, or in social services for our veterans, or in long-term care facilities. People with disabilities are present throughout our communities, our societies, and across our nations. We are artists, authors, politicians, bakers, teachers, revolutionaries, athletes, parents, actors and actresses, students, and people who exist outside of the demographic checkboxes on intake forms. In the context of our global community, and according to the World Health Organization, 15% of the world population are people with disabilities. We are the world's largest minority. In other words, the chances that you will work with a person with a disability is as sure as the fact that all of you, if not already, will also become a person with a disability yourself. You will join this population whether through the natural process of old age, sudden illness, an accident, whether it is temporary or permanent, disability is inevitable. That being said, disability is a natural part of humanity, right? And so when I hold these words up to history, though, I am acutely aware of the hypocrisy of the statement that disability is a natural part of humanity. Because if disability is such a natural part of humanity, why then were disabled people subjected to Hitler's mercy killing, which by the time the war ended led to 275,000 disabled people being killed? And although the war has long ended and we can now name white supremacy and ableism as among the violent contributors to state-condoned murder, mercy killings still exist. So much so that there is a grassroots disabled-led group called Not Dead Yet that continues to do work to uncover the discriminatory practices that lead to euthanasia and mercy killings. And if disability were such a natural part of our lives, why is it then that nearly 600 children with disabilities have been murdered by their parents? In the United States, our media headlines sell these stories of filicide in ways that try to garner our sympathy for the parents, like the tireless sacrifices that they've made to care for their children. And this idea that by killing their child, they've been put out of their misery. In our US judicial system, many of these parents are given lenient sentences because the scales of justice are biased in favor of non-disabled caregivers rather than the deceased child with a disability who never had an opportunity to be heard to begin with. And so that is why every year on March 1st, there's the disability community gathers, whether virtually or in person, on what is known as the Disability Day of Mourning, where we mourn the lives of disabled children. And even now, as many of us seek to hunker down against the waves of a global pandemic, in the US alone, over 40% of the COVID-19 deaths are linked to nursing homes and long-term care facilities, places that are set up to provide care for elderly and disabled people, but are wildly unprepared to manage a pandemic that has come down hard on elderly and people with underlying conditions. We now know that COVID-19 tramples across healthcare systems, whether it is being governed by a socialist, authoritarian, or democratic government. And the pandemic all but considers the medical industrial complex its partner in crime, as together they have brought down entire countries to their knees. What do I mean by that? Well, simply put, whether it is the medical rationing of ventilators to the quote-unquote healthier patient, or the crisis standards of care that are being used by emergency room doctors and ICU doctors, this pandemic shows on an unprecedented scale in our lifetime that disabled lives are not worth saving. And still, I insist on telling you again, disability is a natural part of our human experience and of our humanity. As a disability policy researcher, when I see the numbers of people with disabilities who died in institutional care facilities during the pandemic, there is grief in every single statistic. Because to me, that is another member of my community lost. A disabled person whose story and wisdom that may not get to be shared ever on their own terms. And for some, their stories end on the form that lists their cause of death: failure to thrive, dehydration, respiratory failure. But for me, this is where all of you come in. Because I believe that their story can continue in small part through the work that you do as future social workers. I challenge all of you to practice disability justice-informed social work. Disability is often believed to only exist as a medical diagnosis, but it can be acquired by a person who may have experienced trauma, poverty, violence, incarceration, natural disasters, warfare, among others. By practicing disability justice-informed social work, though, I do not expect you to consistently implement all 10 principles of the framework into every case or client or agency that you come across in your career. Rather, the next time you talk with a young child whose family has just been evicted from their home, consider the principle of recognizing wholeness. In what ways would you help this child identify their own self-worth and humanity as innately valuable? The next time you are at a meeting with other members of the agency that you are at, and all of you are gathered trying to make decisions between one community intervention or another, consider the disability justice principle of leadership of those most impacted, whose voice, insight, and feedback is not in the room that would be most impacted by the agency's decision. The next time you are placed at the intake desk, look critically at the form and how is information being recorded in databases. Because in what ways does the agency's intake process engage with the principle of intersectionality? In your next conversation with an elderly person, what might a service plan centered around the principle of interdependence rather than independence look like? How can our communities show up for the elderly? Many of you will also come across communities whose cultural and political history may not be ones you are familiar with. But what understandings could be gained by taking pause and implementing the principle of cross-movement solidarity in your approach during these moments? The tough work of arriving at these answers to these questions is the work of anti-oppression social work, and I leave that all in your capable hands. The answers to these questions and the other ways each of you can incorporate disability justice principles into social work is also how the stories of disabled people who lost their lives to ableist systems of oppression can continue. Anti-oppression social work, I believe, is about refusing to accept past atrocities as lessons learned in history. Anti-oppression social work is carried out by asking uncomfortable questions in response to an insurmountable global pandemic, and reflecting deeply on the role each of us have for one another's well-being. Because by committing to small acts and rising to this challenge, each of you will have contributed to a future that gets us closer to collective liberation. Thank you. So thank you so much again, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Sandy. If anyone has a question, I'll unmute you if you type that you'd like to ask a question in the chat space.
And I'll send the letter and a copy of my slides to Amanda as well.
Okay, no questions yet.
I see Zareem has her hand up.
Zarima? Okay.
Okay, hi, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Not a question, it's just to say thank you, Sandy. It was like amazing, especially the letter at the end. Like, honestly, it's such an eye-opening, and as a disability justice advocate, I just want to thank you. You're so clear, the message gets through, and yeah, it's not a question, it's more of a thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for that, Sandy. That was truly incredible. I did have a question in terms of if you are comfortable and have the capacity right now to speak to this. I'm finding I'm in my first year of social work at McGill, and I think there's this this like tension or like emergence of like wanting to discuss and teach about disability justice, but often a lot of academia falls into just primarily acknowledging disability rights, and how it feels sometimes like academic like institutions are like unbudging and maybe, you know, don't want to recognize disabled work, specifically disabled people of color's work, which we look to Sins Invalid, and how that's, I'm seeing it not being recognized in my classes and in the textbooks that we have. And I just wondered if, I don't know, if maybe you want to share your thoughts on like navigating institutions of education that don't always recognize disability justice as often as they do disability rights. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I'll start by saying that if you had told me 5 years ago that I would be doing disability policy research at an academic institution, probably would have rolled your eye. I probably would have rolled my eyes. And no, it was a difficult decision to make whether or not to accept the research associate position I have now. And, you know, often to this day, I second guess myself constantly. Like, I'm surrounded by PhDs and postdoc students all day long. And here I am, you know, this kind of scrappy disability justice activist. I'm like, what am I doing here? You know, what purpose can I possibly have in this space, and what can I do in my time at in this position to push back against an entire academic institution, right? It's like me against this brick and mortar mass. And so I definitely feel that question very deeply. So thank you for asking it. And this is just sort of from my perspective, but part of the sort of quote unquote legitimacy that disability rights get is because it is enshrined in laws and policies. It is concrete. It is very black and white. You can count it. You can measure it. You can gather data on it. Very, you know, there's methodologies around this. When activists show up in these spaces, I think what I have seen and what I have had to learn and build the confidence in myself is they get nervous. Like they're like, we are not equipped to, you know, talk about collective liberation, and how do we measure that in our communities yet? And that has been something that I've been trying to grapple with at this point in my career. But I also think that there are ways students can push back, and I know that most days it just feels like you're holding up a boulder on a very steep hill. You're not even pushing it up the hill yet, and that is okay. Like that is something that should happen. And some ways that I have done this is I will cite work like Citizen Ballad and YouTubes and Twitter chats in my papers for my public policy professors. And if they have a problem with it, then like, let's talk about it. But you know what? I count that as qualitative data. I count that as lived experiences. I count that as on equal footing as the policies and the frameworks that we are learning about in my classes. To do the work of legitimizing activist communities, that I think that is where we come in as students. When there is a request for who should be a speaker, I'm constantly sending to my director names of disabled activists, not just people who do research. There are ways and sort of places where we can sort of push our agenda further. So I'll just say thank you for that question, and I am there with you in that resistance.
Thank you. We have a question from Jennifer. I've just unmuted you.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Should I put on my video? I don't know. It's okay. I'll just speak. So I'm a social worker for 18 years in Montreal, and thank you, Sandra. It touched a lot of what's been on my mind for the last 10 months or whatever through the pandemic. I started in the community sector. So when the pandemic, and we in Quebec had some of the highest numbers of infection rates and deaths in long-term care residents, and I don't even know how to digest the information, especially when I was a student in social work in 99 and 2000. All the numbers and forecasts were there about the needs of an aging population, and you spoke about how that happens. So I guess my question to you is, how do I remain an ally? I'm not, I don't have a disability. I'm a white social worker. I'm feeling like, how do I maintain, I find I'm so exhausted, and the system in our reforms in healthcare here, the last reform 4 years ago, is created a mega structure to work. It's just so much more challenging to work in. So how do you maintain hope and being an ally in a disability? I mean, I studied on the disability rights when I was studying social work, and I hold it in my heart. But I find I'm just tired, and I don't know how to keep going as an ally.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think that in response to of how to be an ally during these times, there are current realities and environments that we are all experiencing that we share, whether it's Zoom fatigue, whether it's social distancing, whether it's math, and the isolation that all of us to some degree feel. So that is real, and that informs allyship. And I think that to practice allyship, I would first say that it is a title that has to come from the community that you're working with. I think sometimes it can be problematic if white, and I see this in my own disability rights work, when white disabled people decide suddenly that they are now an ally to disabled people of color, and we're all looking at each other like, well, who decided that? Like, did you wake up and say like, oh, I'm gonna have a new title? And so I say that to answer your question is, continuing to follow the leadership of those who are most impacted, and that's not, it does not have to be all on you. I think that for all of us, self-preservation is key. And what I mean by that is the fight that is to come that we are prepared for is one thing, but as this pandemic has shown us, there's going to be many more fights that are much more challenging that we don't even know is coming our way. And for the disability community, we have learned throughout history that we're consistently on the bottom rung of everybody's political agenda, everybody's nonprofit agenda, everybody's educational and academic agendas. And it becomes this kind of idea ingrained in us that, okay, we need to figure out ways that we can care for one another in our own communities. And I think as an ally, understanding ways that you can be a facilitator of that care between communities is one way that this work can continue to sustain.
Could I just ask one question about when I work with some students who have physical and profound intellectual disabilities. And so I struggle with, they can't voice their own needs within the structure. Like they can, like their day to day, that's what we strive to work and teach and understand. But in terms of the more sort of trajectory in their lives and when they're aging out of the education system, it's where there's pretty much, we're looking at long-term care facilities. And parents are often either overwhelmed or caregivers are just getting by. So how do you, I guess I struggle with who is their voice is what I'm having trouble with, because as you said, it's a bottom, the numbers aren't high, but of the students who we're working with that fit that profile, but they're still absolutely top of my priority list and my work. But there's not really a community that I can converse with that. So when I say ally, I don't even know then what I am. I'm their social worker is really what I am in my professional role, but I don't know where the community is.
Yeah, I think that this is where there's always going to be a gray line, I think, as a social worker. Is like, where is that place between advocacy work that you're doing on behalf of a community, and also ensuring that there is selfhood and self-direction and autonomy in that work as well. And in response to that, I would reach out to and look to older disabled people who may have had similar experiences. They're not going to be exactly the same, but the ingenuity of the disability community. Some will tell you that it's the way that we adapt and accommodate. I will tell you that it's the way that we insist on remaining. And I think that in saying that, there are disabled people who are older, and I will always turn to my work in mentorship to guide that. So I hope that slightly answers the question, but I recognize that it is a difficult question and something that will continuously, you will all continuously come across in your careers.
Thank you so much, Sandy. We actually have to start wrapping up. I don't know if Wanda or Melanie, you wanted to say a few words?
I see a question in the box. I'd rather
Okay,
the student get to ask their question.
Hold on one second. Yuan, I've just unmuted you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandy, for your talk. It was awesome. So my question, I guess I typed it in the chat so I can just read it out. I'm a part of a relatively new Asian collective that focuses on intersectionality and cross-community solidarity. Do you have any resources or directions you could point me to about disability, ableism, and organizing specifically in Asian histories and communities?
Yeah, so I look up to my older sister in community, Alice Wong, all the time. So pretty much everything and anything Alice Wong does, I highly recommend to all of you. But also, in terms of cross-movement solidarity, though, there's a group called 18 Million Rising that I think is doing really incredible, great cross-movement work in terms of Black Lives Matter, and their abolition work, and their de-incarceration work as well. And yeah, they do a really good job of not just reaching out to the younger generations of the movement, but also by grounding it in the history of AAPI organizing. Yeah, they have a really cool zine going on, which I know is something that a lot of AAPI communities in the US and Berkeley area started doing in the 60s, but I would also recommend that. And a shout out to Alice's website, if you don't already know, disabilityvisibilityproject.com.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Again, just before we sign off, if Melanie or Wanda would like to say a few words.
I would just like to say thank you, Sandy. That was so, the way you presented the framework was well done and clear and concise and really helpful, really insightful, very powerful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandy. I really liked how you went through the principles of disability justice, and I definitely identify with the interdependence one. I'm a advocate and activist in the youth and care community, so youth and care alumni community, and we talk a lot about this whole notion of independence and how it's a myth. And it's a myth that's been fabricated by the system to try to convince ourselves that we don't need each other and that we don't need help. And so I really identify with that and this notion of reliance on community. So thank you for sharing that today. And I look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, for having me and for listening.
Thanks again, Sandy. I want to just say thank you from all of us for wrapping up this series so beautifully. And I'm so happy that Lila was also able to be here for the first and last of this series. So we all give you a huge thanks, Sandy, for all your work. And we will, for everyone who is posting about wanting to read the letter again, I think we'll be able to share that. Sandy will send it to me, and we'll post it with the video.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks again so much. So we'll log off, but Sandy, I'll send you a link and we can meet you right after this as well.
All right.
So thanks again, everyone.